Hi for everyone joining us. Welcome. We're just gathering people together now. People are coming online to join us for this superb day of events, as we look at building back better. If you are coming, there will be various different options you should see at the bottom of your screen where you can ask a question or make some points, and we'll look to have people feeding things through. My name's Daniel Singleton. I head up Faith Action. Faith Action is the team that put together today's event. We're really happy to be working with a number of other organisations and looking forward to connecting with you better. But just as people come online, we give people a little bit of chance to come together, and then I'll kick off a little bit with more introductions. If you're signed up just for this first event, which is the Church and Social Cohesion, then let me encourage you also to look at other events we've got coming up today at 12:20, which looks at faith and the COVID response, and then at 4 p.m. looking at faith in the future, how we look at what role the faith should have going forward. And we'll get a taste of all of those things in the excellent report that has been put together by the Free Churches Group, which we'll hear about in just a moment. You know, we're just giving people just a chance to come online. I know people have been jumping on from different things. It's good to see all of our panel are here, and we're joined by the Right Honourable Stephen Timms, who will be leading our panel discussion in a little bit. Let's just give you a moment to gather. If you are into social media, you'll see our hashtag Build Back Better. Very happy for you to come and say positive things on that. If you want to put some challenges up, we can hear those. If you want to say anything particularly negative, then you'll feel free to email me second after this. So we're looking to the positive things. We want some challenges. I'm kidding you. But just see all those things. My screen's all in reverse, so I can't see what you guys see unless I start reading backwards. So hopefully that's all there. Okay, let's rock ahead now and just say a little bit more of what's happening. So for those who've just joined us, my name's Daniel Singleton. I head up Faith Action. We've been working with MHCLG over the past 6 months to help consider how to reopen places of worship and look at the faith-based response to COVID, how we can work together with government. We're pleased to have representation from MHCLG, the Communities Department, with us later on today. We're going to be joined in a little while by the Right Honourable Stephen Timms, who's the chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Faith and Society. He's going to lead our session with a panel after presentations from Theos and from the Free Churches Group. This is a really important time, 2020. Many of us might wish that 2020 didn't happen in the same way, but it has been a really important time for realizing the absolutely vital role that faith groups play for the UK society and of course across the world. We like to say that faith is first in and last out. Now that's not just a comment about emergencies and crisis, although actually faith is often the first to respond, but it's also about longevity and about sticking with it. So we're going to hear lots of things about faith and its role within UK society. We'll get to hear somewhat more. We can cast our minds back to a pre-COVID world as we hear from Theos and from the Free Churches Group, from Hugh Osgood, in a moment. I'm mixing my panelists up as well. And so we're looking forward to hearing from them. But first of all, I just want to welcome you all. Do be aware that this is the first meeting of 3 events happening today. Short and sharp, not going to be too long. There are links in the email you've got for those other meetings, one kicking off at 12:20 and another at 4 p.m. There's much more you can see on our website, and again, links should be in the emails that you've received. We'll put some of those in the chats available for you to see. But let me introduce Hugh Osgood, who is going to give us a little bit of introduction to the Free Churches Group and tell us a little bit about the commission and the report. Thank you, Hugh.
Thank you very much, Daniel. I don't mind being called Hugh Edwards. I mean, he probably earns a whole lot more than I do reading the news and doing all of those kind of things. But for me personally, I've always been concerned about the church's engagement with society. But there have been times when I've also been concerned about society's engagement with the church. And I know that if the church loses confidence in its interaction with society, it only needs to go back to scripture to regain a clear focus. But if society loses confidence in its interaction with the church, then it's the church's responsibility really to put things right. And that means opening up rather than closing down, addressing weaknesses rather than claiming strengths, and serving afresh rather than pleading entitlement. And when we set up the commission that's produced this report, I can say we had absolutely no intention of simply showcasing the church. We genuinely wanted to find out how society thought we as the church were doing. And when we chose social cohesion as our focus, it wasn't because we thought cohesion is something that the church is good at, but we thought it was something that's really important. And we wanted to know if the church is hindering it or helping it. As far as we were concerned, if the church is a stumbling block, we wanted to know. If the church is self-deluded in claiming a measure of success, we wanted to find that out too. And to be honest, we recognize that some past reports on social cohesion have almost tended to problematize the church. And so if the church were indeed to prove problematic, we were determined to put our hands up to that and to propose a reassessment of our approach and a resetting of our agenda. And this was very much the tone of the discussions among the presidents of Churches Together in England that led to the birth of this report. And I'm really delighted that the responsibility for setting up the commission and leading on the report came to us as the Free Churches Group. We as the Free Churches Group have between us around 28% of all of the church congregations in England and Wales. But because we consist of 26 denominations, our joint contribution, although I think it's remarkably united, is not always recognized. But even in saying that, this report is not about the Free Churches Group gaining recognition. It's about the whole church gaining greater and more effective engagement through serving. Now, having mentioned our Welsh denominational members, I need to add that it was on their advice that we agreed to concentrate this report on social cohesion in England. Of course, a Welsh report may follow at a later date if the churches in Wales should be so minded. And perhaps if they're sufficiently inspired by our efforts, it will be something that they're glad to pick up. But what I want to say is how we set about concentrating on England and designing a survey that was capable of being self-critical. Well, choosing the case study areas seemed for us to be the real key. We agreed that it was not about selecting areas on the basis of church performance, but on the basis of obtaining the widest possible spread of cases, a spread that reflected a range of needs, covered a spectrum from little likelihood of social breakdown to high likelihood of social breakdown, and offered a truly representative geographical span. We wanted to be able to say that here is a report without bias, but at the same time, we wanted to be transparent about our methodology. So let me just say a word about why it's been such a privilege for the Free Churches Group to take the lead on this report at this time. Well, our formation as a group actually goes back to 1938, with the Methodists, Baptists, Congregationalists, Presbyterians, and others coming together to appoint the first Free Churches moderator in 1940. So we already had the year 2020 in our sights to celebrate our 80th anniversary. And one of our anniversary aims was to engage with our member congregations rather than with just our member denominations. We've always been great at engaging denominationally and working together at national and binational levels in healthcare, criminal justice, and education, particularly in supplying chaplains to our prisons, our hospitals, and our higher education establishments. But engaging more locally has, in the recent past, largely eluded us. But preparing this report has been great, as it's enabled us to interact with local congregations while assessing their contribution to local cohesion. For us, working with Theos on this report has been a huge privilege. And we trust that as the report proves a real benefit to policymakers, community coordinators, and local churches alike, that it will serve as an eminently suitable way of marking our 80th year, an anniversary which the coronavirus that swept in as our survey was nearing completion could have eclipsed, but which ironically has made our report all the more timely as we seek to build back better. So it's my privilege to commend the report to you and to invite Dr. Madeline Pennington, the report's author and the head of research at Theos, to present a summary of the report's findings. So here it is, the church and social cohesion, connecting communities and serving people. Over to you, Maddie.
Thanks so much, Hugh. I'm going to share my screen because I do have some slides, so hopefully this will work. There we go. Hopefully you can see that. Great. Good morning. And it's incredibly exciting to be here launching this report, especially in the context of this conference, which addresses such vital questions about how we can best move forward in the coming months and years. As Hugh said, the title of the report is The Church and Social Cohesion, Connecting Communities and Serving People. But within this session, we're particularly asking, why is this, that is the church and social cohesion, important to building back better? And I want to give a short answer to that question right away, because I think the findings of our research really all elaborate on this central theme. That society's response to any of the challenges it currently faces relies on the health of those collective relationships we call, in shorthand, social cohesion. Social cohesion is basically about our capacity collectively to come together, whether in celebration, in grief, or in action. Sometimes it feels challenged or absent, like Brexit or racial injustice. In other cases, it's a prerequisite to a solution for a problem. In the pandemic, it's that sense of solidarity which ultimately persuades people to sacrifice their individual freedom for a collective goal. We might also point to cohesion challenges underlying the rise in loneliness, knife and violent crime, how far we're prepared to welcome migrants. The list goes on. So actually, I would say it's vital to all of our future planning. And the report we're launching today has uncovered the many ways in which, at their best, churches are on the front line in that quiet, sustaining work that keeps those collective relationships strong, not just in times of crisis, as was said, but every day. So with that spoiler in mind, I want to give first a very brief overview of what the research actually entailed before exploring three main areas of the report findings. And that's what the nature of the church's contribution actually is. And I think that's a sustainable community building. Secondly, what cohesion assets churches actually have to offer. And third, a bit about how these issues manifest in relationships between councils and churches in particular. So first, what the research entailed. So the project was commissioned to assess, as Hugh says, how local churches impact social cohesion in England, either positively or negatively. And to this end, we conducted over 360 semi-structured interviews across 14 English local authorities. You can see these are the places we visited. Of the participants themselves, 42% were church-based, so church leaders, chaplains, church-based volunteers. And the remainder were from outside the church. So that's actually the majority of people we spoke to. That could be councillors, council officers, police, healthcare professionals, MPs, and of course, other faith leaders. So this is not a study of Christianity at a national level or of the role of institutional churches more widely, but specifically really about local church involvement. And I should say all of the data was gathered before COVID, so it's certainly not a study of pandemic responses. However, it does contain plenty to speak to what happens next. And this leads us nicely to discuss our findings. Because regarding the nature of the church's contribution, it's important to recognise that community cohesion as a distinct policy area has itself largely been shaped in response to crisis moments. That is, when things have already gone wrong. The most influential cohesion policy interventions came after the race riots across parts of northern England in 2001 and the domestic terror attacks of 7/7 in 2005. In the former, faith identities were subtly identified as one of the dividing lines in the parallel lives that led to the riots. In the latter, religion was an actively dangerous context for radicalisation. And this has filtered into the tone of cohesion policy more generally. So cohesion discussion is particularly focused on the need for different faiths to mix, to avoid becoming inward-looking. There's this sense of them as a risk factor. So take, for example, the 2018 Integrated Communities Action Plan. The only mention of faith in the Places and Communities section was a commitment to run, quote, an intensive programme of engagement with communities facing complex issues related to race and faith. So faith, it seems, is seen as a complex issue to be managed. But the situation on the ground in communities seems to be quite a different one. Existing data, that is not in this specific report, suggests that people with a religious affiliation are more likely to be active citizens than those without. That data also suggests that frequently practicing Christians are the most likely religious grouping in London, for example, to join a political party, make a charitable donation, or volunteer regularly. And more than this, in our own study, we found that Christian faith was a key motivation for our church-based participants' community engagement. This was expressed also in blatantly theological terms. Here you see there common themes included the desire to build the kingdom, to look to the margins, love of neighbour, salt and light, doing what Christ seeks, following Christ's example, and seeking the prosperity of the city. So there has been a slight disjoint between policy and the situation on the ground. And the vast majority of churches we have seen in this research are not complex issues to be solved or managed or overcome. They are rather sites of belonging, nurturing and motivating factor for people to get involved and to champion their communities in a sustainable way, albeit in a way which is less likely to make the headlines. I'd say another aspect of that disjoint is that in practice, social cohesion isn't actually just about getting people to mix with those who are not like them. That's the main focus of cohesion policy, and it's clearly very important. But so too, cohesion is about creating a society in which everyone feels people like me have a stake. And this involves celebrating and nurturing churches as part of that daily sustained work of community. So bonding, bringing people together, bridging how different groups act with each other, need to be fostered together, not apart. Now that might all sound very well, but what do churches actually have to offer their communities besides goodwill? Well, in the report, we set out 6 main categories of cohesion assets that churches often have to offer: buildings, social networks, leadership, convening power, volunteers, and vision. I'm going to go through each now, and I should say that this will focus on what churches give at their best. We did find an overwhelmingly positive situation on the ground, but of course that doesn't mean that all churches are beyond reproach, and we can talk about areas in which they could do better in the Q&A, I think. Mainly we find the bad examples of where these assets are being either misdirected or underused, which is partly why we've taken this approach. But I want to give a sense of what churches are capable of offering our recovery when they're doing their best. So first, buildings. Of course, under current regulations, church buildings are mostly being used for a quite limited set of activities, and this reduces the number of chance encounters and new friendships which might start in them. But in normal time, they are vital gathering points for community activity, offered cheaply or for free, and unlike many statutory services, scattered equally through communities, rather than being concentrated only in busy metropolitan centres. The cohesion impact of this physical space is particularly marked given the dramatic decline in other forms of community space over recent years. So more than 600 youth centres closed across Britain over the last 6 years. Since 2005, the number of public libraries fell by 27%. Between 2001 and 2018, the number of pubs fell by 26%. As a council-based participant remarked to us, there is an issue with building assets. I think people assume that the council has loads of buildings that anyone can use and can just rent them for cheap or for free. And that isn't the case. Of course, buildings can also be experienced as a distraction or a burden by congregations themselves, and churches which don't have their own buildings also face additional cohesion challenges, including, it seems, greater suspicion from outside parties. Given that those sectors of British Christianity which are growing are also those which are least likely to have their own buildings, that's particularly immigrant congregations I'm thinking of here, I think these sorts of issues and tensions are likely to grow over time. So I'd encourage policymakers not to assume buildings automatically convey legitimacy, or indeed to assume that their maintenance is a given. This can all change, but at the moment, church buildings are a really important source of social capital. Secondly, networks. Churches are not only embedded in their communities physically, but also socially. One participant described social networks built up around churches as the capillary level of our communities. That's the level of the circulatory system which reaches the bits nothing else can. These networks can be consolidated through worship. And again, that's when people bond around a specific shared faith, but also bridging across all sorts of other difference. But of course, also they grow through many community events which are run in and by churches. Such networks are a direct antidote to social isolation and loneliness. They amplify community responses, and they cascade information quickly and effectively through communities. Thirdly, leadership. Churches are wellsprings of formal and informal community leadership, forming and paying community champions who take initiative and empower their neighbourhoods. Most obviously, public faith leadership can be extremely helpful in times of crisis, but churches can also be places where the natural skills and passions of ordinary Christians are nurtured, as I've said. So not only are churches essentially paying people to invest in the social and spiritual capital of neighbourhoods up and down the country, but there is a soft leadership premium here too. Many church-based participants particularly stress their concern to build up a sense of dignity or purpose in their local areas, in individuals and in groups. And that sort of sense of pride of place and pride in individual capacity, I think, is really important to cohesion. Fourth, convening power. We found several striking instances where churches and church leaders were acting as trusted facilitators, bringing together other community stakeholders in times of challenge or celebration. To take one example, in Croydon, the church leaders facilitated the first community meetings after the London riots, as they were seen as neutral and trusted parties, where people were actually directing their anger and fear at the other obvious community stakeholders, so council, police, for example. Now, this convening role can be bolstered in Anglican contexts by the establishment of the Church of England, but I want to say actually it's much broader than that, as a gathering force which emerges out of a combination of leadership and networks. As one participant noted from the church, I think churches are natural conveners. It's our nature, we congregate. So we get what it takes to bring people out. That is the nature of the church. Come, I'll make you fishers of men. Fifthly, volunteers. Volunteering activity is often used as a proxy measure for cohesion in its own right, as a sign of civic engagement, and churches are good at turning out volunteers. Their contribution is not always focused on Christian-run activities, but the churches do also play another important role, and that's coordinating volunteers where activity is church-based. And of course, volunteering is once again a reflection of that motivation to serve that Hugh spoke about, which brings us finally to vision. A vision for change and transformation is perhaps the most important, certainly the most unifying of the church's cohesion assets. It's what we found really made the difference between churches that were fulfilling their potential and those that weren't. Of course, churches don't have a monopoly on vision by any means, and sometimes aspects of some churches' vision can be divisive or damaging. But we want to affirm, I think it's quite obvious, that community initiatives do, in all contexts, work best where there is a vision driving them forward. And we have seen how this can emerge naturally from the faith of Christians who feel led by God to serve their communities. Again, just as churches should make efforts to learn the language of other community stakeholders, those outside the church shouldn't be threatened by this sort of language. Rather, it is a gift to and a strength of the community. So the sorts of assets we might hope every flourishing community has: places to meet, strong networks, robust leadership, channels for resolving difference, people willing to give back, and a vision for the future. These assets are all commonly found in churches, flowing out, in this context, from a Christian motivation to love and serve. Of course, though, no community is built by one group in isolation. That's kind of the point. And the report closes by evaluating how churches work with other community stakeholders. We take 3 case studies here. We look at interfaith work, ecumenical work, and church-council relationships. But I thought for the purposes of today's discussion, it would be better just to focus on one of them. So I'm going to talk about church-council relationships. And in an age of austerity, local authorities have, by necessity, strengthened their engagement with churches as they take on a greater role, particularly even in the provision of basic services. But we found churches were less often included in conversations and initiatives pertaining to cohesion issues. And this is a missed opportunity. Basically, councils will approach churches when they need them to do something, but less so drawing on this full range of assets in other contexts. At the same time, councils can be quite concerned about proselytism and the exemptions which religious groups have from the Equality Act 2010. Now, there is actually in that act legal provision to prevent inappropriate discrimination where religious groups are acting on behalf of a public authority. So too, we found that the vast majority of churches had reflected carefully on the appropriate role of their faith in providing safe and accessible services. That said, it's important to recognise that while churches want to serve, they are not, by their nature, secular service providers. So we also heard that there were some aspects of secular service delivery that church-based participants wouldn't be comfortable imitating. 2 notable examples, giving different arrangements for people with no recourse to public funds came up, and also taking a role in law enforcement. Churches said that they basically felt that was not their job, and I think we would expect that they would not be taking on those roles. Many participants also expressed a sense of being used by the state, where they were being expected to provide service without sharing any of their motivations for serving. Now, of course, these are tricky issues and they come up a lot. But I think it seems these relationships work best where the distinctive assets of each party are recognised on their own terms for what they can uniquely bring. And to this end, resources such as the Faith Covenant produced by the APPG on faith and society are really helpful in outlining basic expectations and best practice on both sides, so that both sides can be released, if you like, to do what they can. So we'd encourage councils and all faith groups to draw on these resources in their work together. So that's a taster of what the report finds churches can be giving communities at their best. And from all that, I just want to draw attention to our 3 overarching conclusions, from which flow a few specific recommendations for churches and policymakers in particular. First, we need to invest in cohesion as a sustainable resource, not just as a sticking plaster for when things go wrong. This becomes especially clear, ironically, in times of crisis like now. Perhaps this is why cohesion policy interventions follow periods of stress and division. But it's a bad way to form community strategy. And churches are emblematic of a quieter, more sustainable approach that views cohesion as a desirable outcome in its own right. So drawing deep from these wells of neighbourliness and service will be vital as we move forward to rebuild after the pandemic. And one of our main recommendations to policymakers is to work alongside churches as one element of a move away from the crisis-driven response towards a focus on sustainable communities. Secondly, while churches have these really concrete and useful assets that can be put to positive use in the community, they aren't generic community groups, and their full potential is best realised where the distinctive features that come with their Christian motivation are recognised. This is also reflected in the sorts of assets they have, particularly in the sort and scope of relationships they foster. Aspiring to relationships in which all parties can be most fully what they do best is really important here. This requires policymakers to be open-minded about what churches can offer, but it should also involve churches looking at what they have in an open and creative manner, systematically thinking about how they're best positioned to love their neighbours. It also requires both to learn the language of the other, whether that's policy or theology, so common ground can be recognised and differences more fully understood. Thirdly, our research underlines that truly cohesive societies are not those in which everybody agrees, but they're those in which everyone feels they have a stake. So we argue that the bonding capital that churches, and indeed faith groups in general, bring should be celebrated and nurtured as part of a more rounded cohesion approach, both in its own right, but also as a gateway to better, more confident bridging between groups. So I've just put these in some recommendation form. I'll let you look down them there. And I'll close by saying that, of course, there is more in the report itself and in the two how-to booklets which accompany the report. So one of those is for churches looking to engage better and more effectively with cohesion issues. The other is for people wanting to engage with churches and how to work most fruitfully with them. But I wanted to focus on the elements of the report today which deal with that fundamental question we're considering: the church and social cohesion. Why does it matter to building back better? My answer is a society which embraces the role of churches on this basis will be a more rounded one, more able to face shared challenges, more comfortable with difference, and more confident in its underlying unity. That's to say, it will be more cohesive, both at a local level and beyond. And as we look forward to the kind of society we want after the pandemic, the kind of collaborative effort we're going to need to build it, I hope this is a vision we can embrace. Thank you.
Thank you, Maddie. That's very helpful and gives us a really good start. Let me not linger too long, but hand straight over to the Right Honourable Stephen Timms, who is Chair of the APPG on Faith and Society and MP for East Ham. Stephen.
Thank you, Daniel, and thank you very much, Madeline, for a very interesting presentation and a very interesting report. And thank you to Hugh as well for the support of the Free Churches group for this work. We're joined as well as by Madeline and Hugh by two new panelists. So let me just invite them to say a word. First of all, Dr. Joel Edwards, who was for 11 years General Director of the Evangelical Alliance, followed by 10 years in leadership at Micah Challenge International. Joel, do you want to just respond to what you've heard about the report?
Yes, thank you so much. Let me add my thanks as a member of the Commission to Madeline and Hugh for doing a sterling job in keeping the train on the rails over a period of time, which has been very, very important. I think the report speaks to the assumption from Archbishop Temple that the church exists for the benefit of its non-members. And it's so interesting that this conversation, which has been a conversation for many years now, hasn't it, Faith in the City onwards, is therefore important in terms of its timing. And I think when we on the Commission gathered, we had no sense that the timing would be so fortuitous. Starting in 2018, 10 years after a global collapse, and now anticipating the future of recovery and therefore the role of the church within that. Three reflections, which I think summarizes some of the key thoughts for those of us on the Commission as we serve together. The first, I think, was that we were really keen, as has already been said, that this was not a PR job for the church. This wasn't us giving ourselves positive strokes. We wanted to look objectively, and so really important, 42% of those we spoke to were from the church, the majority from outside. And the second thing I think, which was very important to us, was that we didn't want to review activism. We actually wanted to ask, what are the philosophical drivers behind the church's participation in contributing to social cohesion, where in fact we discovered we were. And theology was important. If theology is too much of a mouthful, just think Good Samaritan. And therefore the thinking behind the action we're suggesting is, as has been shown from the research, sustainable response, not knee-jerk, not crisis, but sustainable. And I think the third important thing for us was that we have felt that bonded capital and bridging capital are not mutually exclusive. And I think this goes right to the heart of the concept of partnership. So possibly inadvertently, this is a kind of apologetic for Christian church faith engagement in the public square and in social cohesion. And it suggests, I think, that the church is an imperfect contribution to social cohesion, not a problem to be avoided. And I think as we face the next 10 years of post-COVID recovery, churches will be and should be a part of finding a positive solution. And as the report itself says, churches, we hope, should not be dismissed out of hand, should be embraced as a part of building a better future together.
Thank you, Joel, very much. Let me welcome as well Dr. Manmit Bambra, who is at the Religion and Global Society Research Unit of the London School of Economics and is coordinating its inaugural project on strengthening religious cooperation in global London. You're quite a new unit, Manmit, is that right?
Yeah, that's right, Stephen. Thank you for the introduction. We launched earlier this year. The research unit is part of the LSE Faith Centre that some of you may be familiar with. And we have now established this new research unit, and this is our first project. And I'm leading this project and coordinating it with the rest of the team.
Smashing, thank you. And I'm going to ask you to respond to the report as well. Before I do that, let me just remind everybody that you can put a question into the Q&A, and when Manmit has spoken, I'll be able to hopefully put some questions that have come in that way to the panel as a whole. But Manmit, just give us a response to the report.
Thank you. I'll try and keep my comments brief so we've got time for questions. Thank you so much to Daniel, Madeline, and the rest of the team, Hugh, for sending me this wonderful report and the opportunity to reflect on it today. I really enjoyed reading it. It's a very impressive piece of work, I think, just methodologically in terms of the amount of data that's been collected here and in different locations, which is really useful to us as we're doing our own research project, which is based in London. These projects that look at different locations, they offer sort of how generalizable these trends are across the country, which is really useful to contextualize some of the work that we're doing. I think it's really important to think of places of worship, churches, as so important in this debate on community cohesion and social cohesion. Places of worship are not just where people go to pray, but they offer support, they offer networks, they offer lots of different social and personal attributes that lots of people are very much missing, especially in my community, the Sikh community. The temple is not somewhere you just go to pray, it's often where you go for community, you go for support and a sense of belonging. I thought that the report was, the way that bonding and bridging capital was used was actually very useful to me as a sociologist, because often bonding and bridging capital is a concept that is not used enough, I think, in these sorts of discussions, because it's not just about the kind of formal sort of connections, which are sometimes bridging, but also the extent to which they create a sense of bond. And that's very much something that we're looking at in our project at the moment. So the project is about interfaith. It's primarily youth focused, and it's about the future of interfaith and young people and how interfaith works and so forth. So I'll focus more on the interfaith aspect of the report, which I found really useful because as the report shows, there is lots of churches are very involved in interfaith. They're very open to it, but there's different levels of involvement and enthusiasm across, which is no surprise. We see that in all communities. So how does that fit with what we're doing? We're finding a similar trend in our work. But churches can be so important in interfaith, and they do so much more interfaith, I think, even sometimes than they're aware of. They're often a hub for informal interfaith. And that's really been very salient, I think, with the recent pandemic. So if I just read a quote that really spoke to me in the interfaith part of the report, which said that, which kind of says that it's not just about formal interfaith, but it's also about informal interfaith. And the quote says, a particular task might form the heart of engagement, for example, where people from different faiths come together to cook a shared meal, pick litter, or lobby on behalf of a shared cause. The church and other organisations or political concern. Focusing on a shared task can establish a spirit of equality and bridging relationships rather than one party feeling like the initiator or helper throughout. And that's something that we're seeing in our work as well with young people, in the sense of this action, this informal social action around doing a task is very powerful in creating bonding capital. So that was really helpful for us as a research unit to see that theme appear in the report as well. So just to finish on my remarks, I wonder how we can sort of take this forward, because there is a significant finding in our work that this task-based interfaith work is really important in creating bonding capital, especially through young people. So I wonder how the church and other places of worship can utilise their buildings, their networks to facilitate this type of work going forward. And I think one of the questions is again about dialogue between different organisations and places of worship, and how to, and because we're doing our work is youth focused, I wonder how we can use the findings of this report to facilitate younger people becoming more involved, using existing structures, and to build back better between and within communities. Stop there.
Actually, thank you, Manmit, very much. And it sounds like a very interesting project that you're leading there. Right, we've got a number of questions that have come in. So let me go back first, I think, to Madeline. I mean, a question from me, Madeline, is in the report you focused on local areas rather than focusing on national institutions. I wonder if you can just tell us why you took that approach. And Peter Barnes has put a question into the Q&A, and please do that if anyone else would like to ask a question or two. His question is, did the report talk to service users? Was that part of what you did?
Yeah, just so to come back on whether service users were consulted, yes. So we would often, so there are two ways in which they were consulted. Some of our participants were service users, and we spoke to them about what they had found coming to church-based services. Also, while we were visiting these places, we obviously went and observed a number of cohesion initiatives across the areas. So the 360 figure that you've seen there is the formal interviews, but actually we spoke to more people than that in terms of attending a church-based service or initiative, lunch, whatever, and speaking to them about basically how the church was doing, whether they found it a useful service or not. So that's the answer there. In terms of why we chose to focus on local rather than national, I think, well, there's lots that I could say to that. I think that too often the conversation is really on this national level, and there is a perhaps disjoint in terms of how faith is seen nationally versus what's actually happening at local level. And it seems to be a sort of correction of the narrative there a bit. And I think, you know, plenty is said about the role of Christianity in our national sense of self, issues of, you know, secularization, establishment, those kinds of issues, and they're important issues, and there is a place to discuss them. They're not the focus of this research, because I think we wanted to see how much that was filtering down into ordinary communities. And I would say actually there is stuff on national issues in the report, but it's when it came up locally. So I think it's about working out how much of that discourse is filtering down locally and using that as the starting point, rather than just assuming that what people talk about in newspapers or whatever, it is what's happening in a village in the middle of East Lindsey. So that's sort of where our thinking was there.
Okay, thank you, Madeline, very much. Now, several questions have come forward. Let me just pick up this one. Jonathan Clark asks about the issue that you mentioned and Joel mentioned as well, about the churches and faith generally being regarded as a problem to be solved rather than a strength for society as a whole. And he says, any thoughts on how we do that with national as well as local government? Let me just make a point here that I chair the all-party parliamentary group on faith and society. We've just published a report of research carried out over the summer with a questionnaire sent to every council in the UK. And what's clear from the results of that is that councils have worked a lot more with faith groups over the pandemic than they were doing before, and their experience of doing that has been really positive. And for example, the proselytism issue that you mentioned, Madeline, we asked councils whether that had been a problem, and hardly anybody said it had been a problem. They were much more talking about the professionalism of the faith groups that they'd partnered with to get food to people and the other things that had to be done during the pandemic. And that, by the sound of it, it's been a really positive experience and a big expansion of partnership working at the local level. But Jonathan's question is, how can we do this with national as well as local government? And I'd be interested to hear from any of the panelists about, maybe I'll ask you, Madeline, first, because you've talked a bit about this already. How can we persuade government that faith provides opportunities, it's not a problem to be solved?
I think part of it, I will let other people come in, but I think part of it is about recognising in what conditions existing policy has actually emerged. And I think that is why it's important to include that story of how cohesion policy interventions have often come at these moments of real crisis, and the specific conditions of those crises then get extrapolated out, which are perfectly fair observations in those crises, but they get extrapolated out as the narrative. So I think part of that is about, and it goes back to why we look locally as well, it's about drawing back to that kind of sort of earthier sense of, you know, what's actually going on in our local communities. I think also I would say one thing I could have spoken more about and didn't mention too much is the role of public faith leadership. Partly I didn't mention it because I think it is drawn attention, it has a lot of attention anyway, but I think the role of public voices, where churches have public voices, that they are reflecting this sort of contribution, that they are championing what's going on in local areas. You know, they are influential, they have sway, and I think that is part of it too.
Smashing, thank you. And you mentioned earlier the covenant, which the faith covenant that the all-party group has produced, just setting out kind of half a dozen things for councils to sign up to if they want to work with faith groups, and half a dozen things for the faith groups to sign up to if they want to work with local authorities as well. And that seems to us to be a helpful way forward. But let me ask each of the other panelists what you think about, you know, how can government be persuaded that what faith is offering is not a problem to be solved, but a strength, a resource for society as a whole? Manmit, what's your perspective on that?
It's quite a hard question to answer. I think often we hear from faith and faith groups, like as Madeline said, when there's an issue, when there's a problem, when something's happened, and there's not that sort of consistent dialogue that goes on all the time. And I think one thing that the report shows is the extent of positive community cohesion and positive initiatives that the church and other places of worship are doing. So I think maybe we need to try and make more of that in public discourse and in dialogue, and have more events or more conversations around the other things that faith does, other than just responding to a crisis, which sometimes can be responsible for this kind of connotation, these kind of negative connotations or temporal associations with faith groups. So that would be, it's quite a general idea, but I think that would help a lot.
John Simmons has made the point that local government only talks to us when there is a crisis, which is a fair comment, I think. Joel, you touched on this, the faith being seen as a problem. How can we persuade government to think differently, do you think?
Yeah, I think it comes off the previous question. And I would suggest that this isn't just a local, regional, national question, it's a global issue. So I think historically there's been a clash of ideologies, a clash of mutual distrust from the UN, the way we handle different attitudes around internationalism. And I think it's about each recognizing our mutual strengths, each recognizing our mutual weaknesses, but getting back to this issue of the tension between bonding and bridging. And so I think this is why it's absolutely right that the report looked at local expressions of collaboration as the granular experience of differences come together around practical responses to real needs. And so I think it's in the empirical evidence, not just the big philosophical discussions. I think it's in the empirical evidence as we talk together about what we are doing, the food banks, the kind of cinnamon trust expressions, that we begin to erode mutual suspicion and actually test the differences between our ideology, whether it's a secular one or a faith-based one, and to see that at the end of the day, we're after the same thing, building a better world. And we may have different ideological impulses, but actually when it comes down to it, we're all after the same thing. And I think that's how we begin to redress this age-old imbalance rather.
Thank you, Joel. One of the things that came out really strongly from our survey from the councils was a comment on the professionalism of the faith groups that they've had to work with over the summer, because or over the last 8 months, because they're really in a lot of communities there isn't anyone else to work with, and it's been a very positive experience for those councils. Hugh, what's your comment about how we can move beyond churches being seen as a problem? Hugh, you're muted, I think.
Yeah, well, I do think reports like this that go down to the local level are really helpful. I think there's a lot of evidence of good positive engagement in that kind of way. I'd like to see more. I'd like to see churches being more confident in working with local government, and local government being more confident in working with churches. I think, and faith groups. I think there's a lot still to do on that. But I think that there's so much positive on the ground that we need to hold that up. I think when it comes to the national level, we have a few challenges. One of the challenges is that very often the church is good at shouting its objections at things, and that can sometimes actually block out a lot of other conversation. And I think that what Mamit said about discourse is absolutely important. There's got to be a continual conversation. And I think that is really something that we need to work on. And I'd like to see that happening more. I'm hoping that what we're reflecting up from the local level, because I think there is an upward movement from that, will actually gain attention at a central government level so that we can have some effective conversations. I think particularly in Ministry of Housing and Communities and Local Government, obviously they're looking at what's happening at a local government level. So I think there's been some very constructive conversations that have come out during this whole pandemic. But one of the things that does show up is that there's a long way to go in these conversations in terms of understanding where each other's coming from. And that's why I just think it's important. What I really hope is that the conversations that have begun during the pandemic, when the churches have been very effective in delivering things, will actually continue, both at a local level, but at a central government level. And I think the church has got to realize that sometimes conversation needs to take place when campaigning might be the default position. We've got something we want to say, so let's shout it loud and clear, rather than just say, well, can we sit down and talk about this? So I think that, the Moses model in the Old Testament had its place where you confront, but we do need to realize that were people like Daniel and Joseph that had a very different relationship with government. And we need more of that as well, so that there's conversation within.
Certainly the councils we heard from were very keen to maintain the relationships that have been forged during the pandemic and build on them for the future. And for national government, I think the minister is going to be joining us shortly, so we'll see what he's got to say. Madeleine, a couple more points to you. Steve Summers says, is the term serving people patronising? Should we instead talk about partnership or co-production? And Greg Smith asks, what's your working definition of social cohesion? I'll pick those two up.
Write them down so that I don't lose that. Serving, is it patronising? I don't think so. I think that there is a risk where services are being provided, or indeed not services, just a lunch club or something, that the person who is say a lunch club, someone's serving you food, then it has that kind of connotation of them being in a power position. And I think that really is what Cohesion is trying to tackle, that it's not about power, it's about an equal relationship. But actually the church understands serving more as, being a servant. And that isn't about giving people what you've decided they need. That is actually about being in a posture of listening and being open. And I think that there are some really practical things that can be done there. I mean, you know, at the risk of oversimplifying it, obviously power dynamics are hugely complicated, but, you know, initiatives where everybody was wearing a name tag, you know, the people serving and the people using the service, for example, just immediately felt more like friendship than anything else. And so there's that kind of careful thinking about how to create a space that doesn't feel patronizing, I think, which is really important. I'm glad for the question, because I think this is really absolutely at the heart of what social cohesion is trying to achieve, is a relationship that is not patronizing. But I do take that. In terms of definition of social cohesion, it is hugely contested what social cohesion means. And we asked all of our participants what they understood by social cohesion, which was a really interesting exercise. What I ended up feeling is that often it's usually a sort of tick list of things that communities have, like, you know, trust in institutions, that kind of thing. Really, it's about the strength of your collective relationship. So outside your immediate social circle, your family and your close friends, how much do you feel connected to those people? So my informal definition is actually, if you get on a bus, how much do you think that your well-being is tied to the person who you've never met that just happens to be sat next to you? And I think that is really the quality of community that we're trying to achieve.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to ask Joel for a very, very quick answer, because time is running out, to one specific question from Jeremy Riddell. Given that most people, especially most younger people, are non-religious, how can bridging be created in an inclusive, non-threatening way, given the church's drive for evangelism? Quick thoughts on that?
Yes. My local church has an initiative called Spark to Life. The idea is that it meets individuals who have been through the criminal justice system and want to get a new start to life. And the idea here is that we come along in a totally non-patronizing way to assist people to get back into the mainstream of employment and so on. Now you multiply that across the humongous number of local initiatives which churches, even other faiths, provide for community. And I think we have one of many possible triggers by which young people who are outside of the realm of the church are not really coming in to be proselytized, but who have real needs, mental health, relational issues. One of the things I'm very excited about, and although this didn't come up specifically in the report, is the multiplicity of such ministries, service points, reaching young people beyond the church doors. And I think it's one of the exciting features and methods by which the church is seeking to, yes, serve in a way which is non-patronizing.
Thank you, Joel. And that does, I think, pretty much finish at the time that we've got. One question that Jawed Khan has asked to me is, how nationally can we work better so that faith groups feel they're involved when it comes to policies relating to places of worship in response to COVID-related challenges? This has been a recent issue, I think, that policies seem to be getting made without listening to churches. It's perhaps a question to put to the minister when he's here, although of course it is the case that the government has just launched a major consultation exercise about its relationship with faith communities. So I think there is an opening at the moment to make clear the importance of engaging faith groups properly in these decisions about how COVID is handled, and in the future about lots of other decisions as well. But can I thank our panel very much. Thank you, Manmit. Thank you, Joel. Thank you, Madeline, very much for a great report and a great presentation. And thank you, Hugh, for supporting this initiative and enabling it to happen. And I'm going to hand back to Daniel.
Thank you, Stephen, and a big thank you to you for chairing that session. I know for many of us that come into conferences like this, we feel that we've got things to say and not necessarily the opportunity to say them. So we have put on an extra session today at 1:45, we will actually be putting people into smaller groups and making an opportunity live for people to have their say and to put their points across. It's worth understanding at the moment that Faith Action is working with MHCLG on feeding through the kind of opinions and thoughts that were just part of that last question that Stephen shared. So please do come to us, and we do faithfully put reports through to the department and challenge them. And I'm sitting on the task force with the Secretary of State and the Faith Minister as well. So, and our next session at 12:20, we'll be hearing for some other task force members and other faith leaders, and then that session at 1:45 follows on from that. Do make sure you check on those links. Now, here is the dangerous bit, that essentially this is the break where everyone goes away and doesn't come back again. It would be a shame if you were not to come back, and please do join us for our next session. We have got a late entry. We've got Colin Bloom, who is heading up that government review on faith engagement. He will be coming to join us in the next session. So some new and on the foot changes there, and there'll be opportunity to hear from him. And as I say, opportunity for more panel discussion. I want to thank everyone for coming. Can I also say at this point, I want to give a big thank you to the Faith Action team that have been working, some of which will be going on to other things. They've been working hard to put this event on and actually work over the last 6 months. So a big thank you to them and recognition of their hard work. And thank you for Maddie and Hugh joining us today and giving us such a great report. The panelists, I want to hang on to you and get you to come again. So be warned, we'll be chasing you up. So that's it for us. We'll turn our live off now and connect with you again at 12:20.